What if the world's most imposing fortresses and stone monuments were not beginnings, but endings? What if these massive walls and perfectly cut stones are only the final visible layer of stories that stretch far deeper into the past? In this film, we follow a pattern that appears again and again across continents, places that seem to emerge suddenly, yet carry the weight of much older human presence. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden layers of history and questioning what we think we know, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more journeys like this. High above the Wakhan corridor, where the mountains of the Pamirs compress human movement into a narrow ribbon of river, pasture, and sky, the remains known as Yamchun Fortress cling to an exposed ridge of stone. The setting feels almost hostile to permanence. Wind-scoured, austere, and elevated far beyond the comfort of ordinary settlement, the ridge seems an unlikely place for long-term human presence. And yet, it is precisely this improbability that draws attention to the depth of time embedded in the site. Yamchun does not simply overlook the corridor below, it appears to emerge from it. The fortress walls follow the ridge so closely that the boundary between construction and geology becomes difficult to define, as if stone had been persuaded rather than forced into defensive form. The foundations merge with bedrock in a way that suggests continuity with the landscape rather than domination over it, implying that the choice of location was guided by long familiarity rather than sudden strategic inspiration. The fortress is traditionally attributed to the early medieval period and is often associated with Sasanian defensive systems established to monitor the eastern frontiers of Iranian influence. In this view, Yamchun functioned as a frontier stronghold intended to oversee trade routes, regulate movement through the corridor, and project authority in a region where political boundaries were porous and frequently contested. This interpretation is reasonable, but it only partially accounts for the complexity revealed by the site's form and setting. The walls do not impose rigid geometry. Instead, they trace the contours of the ridge, adjusting to slopes and outcrops with an economy of effort that implies intimate knowledge of the terrain. Masonry techniques vary noticeably. Some sections rely on roughly fitted local stone, while others display more regular coursing, suggesting multiple construction phases rather than a single unified plan. These variations point to adaptation and reuse, a structure shaped over time rather than conceived in a single moment. Archaeological investigation in the Pamirs has long been constrained by altitude, climate, and access, and Yamchun itself has never been excavated at a scale sufficient to establish a definitive chronology. Even so, surface analysis and comparison with nearby sites indicate that this ridge held significance well before the Sasanian period. The Wakhan corridor was not simply a political boundary or trade route. It was one of the few inhabitable passages through an otherwise extreme highland environment, channeling seasonal migration, caravans, and cultural exchange since deep prehistory. Evidence from surrounding valleys points to human presence from at least the Bronze Age, with pastoralist communities adapting to high-altitude conditions through cyclical movement and careful management of localized resources. Within such a system, elevated observation points would have been valuable long before the emergence of formal fortifications. Surveillance did not require walls. Awareness of movement, weather, and access routes could be maintained through familiarity and repeated use. Seen in this light, Yamchun's construction may represent the formalization of a much older pattern. A ridge long used for observation and territorial awareness gradually transformed into a permanent defensive installation without fully erasing its earlier role. This interpretation gains weight when considering the limited evidence for domestic architecture within the fortress itself. The absence of clear residential structures suggests that Yamchun may never have supported a large permanent population, functioning instead as a strategic or seasonal station, activated when conditions demanded and left relatively dormant at other times. Such a rhythm sits uneasily with conventional narratives of continuous military occupation, but aligns well with longer-term patterns of highland use. The enclosed area within the walls is larger than would be strictly necessary for a small garrison, raising questions about whether the space also served auxiliary functions, storage, refuge for surrounding communities, or the symbolic marking of controlled territory rather than purely martial defense. As with other sites in the region, the challenge is not that Yamchun lacks history, but that its earliest phases remain archaeologically understated. There is a perceptible gap between the inferred beginnings of the ridge's significance and the visible remains that anchor the site to recorded history. The Sasanian attribution rests primarily on stylistic comparison and regional defensive logic rather than direct dating evidence. This does not invalidate the association, but it leaves open the possibility that what survives is not the origin of the site's importance, but its culmination. Geological factors further complicate interpretation. The Pamirs are seismically active and subject to extreme freeze-thaw cycles capable of erasing or distorting earlier construction, particularly if those constructions relied on perishable materials such as timber or compacted earth. In this context, the absence of early monumental remains becomes less surprising and more a reflection of environmental attrition than historical absence. Even so, the coherence of Yamchun's placement suggests intentionality that predates imperial organization. The understanding of sightlines, approach routes, and seasonal movement embodied in the site would have been accumulated gradually through generations of local knowledge rather than imposed suddenly from a distant center of power. Medieval travel accounts, though sparse, refer to fortifications in the Wakhan as part of a broader defensive landscape, yet they offer little insight into how long these sites existed before being absorbed into state systems, effectively compressing centuries of earlier use into a single functional label. Modern interpretations often inherit this compression, treating Yamchun as a static monument tied to a specific political moment, when its physical form instead records a sequence of adjustments responding to shifting needs. The very remoteness that gives the site its present sense of isolation would, in earlier periods, have amplified its importance. Control of even a narrow corridor could shape regional interaction, and such control did not require constant occupation, only the capacity to assert presence when necessary. In this sense, Yamchun may be better understood not as a fortress in the conventional sense, but as a long-lived threshold, a place where awareness of movement, boundary, and elevation slowly crystallized into stone. The prehistoric dimension here does not lie in hidden chambers or lost civilizations, but in the continuity of perception, the recognition that this ridge mattered long before walls defined it, and that fortification marked the end point of a process rather than its beginning. As the ruins stand today beneath the vast Pamir sky, their outlines softened by time, they offer no clear marker of when observation became defense or when familiarity with the land turned into authority over it. What remains unresolved is not who built Yamchun, but how long the ridge had already been shaping human behavior before stone made that relationship visible. The Gigantia temples rise from the gently sloping plateau of Chagra on the island of Gozo in the Maltese archipelago, with a presence that feels disproportionate to the modest scale of their surroundings. Set against open farmland and low stone walls, their mass conveys an impression of stillness and gravity, as if the landscape itself has paused around them. Constructed from warm, honey-colored limestone, the walls swell outward in rounded profiles that feel less like architecture imposed upon nature and more like stone patiently shaped through long familiarity with place and material. For centuries, these structures were explained through folklore as the work of giants. The explanation did not arise from carved monsters or mythic imagery, but from the sheer size of the stones themselves. Blocks weighing several tons challenge intuitive assumptions about what small Neolithic island communities could realistically accomplish with simple tools. Built during the 4th millennium BCE, the Gigantia temples predate both Stonehenge and the pyramids of Egypt, placing them among the earliest known freestanding stone monuments in the world. Despite this antiquity, the temples occupy an archaeological category that is both well-defined and curiously isolated. They form part of a broader Maltese temple tradition that flourished for over 1,000 years before vanishing entirely, leaving no written language, no historical accounts, and only limited material clues about how the society that built them structured its daily life. What survives is monumental architecture without a clear social narrative to explain it. At first encounter, the dominant impression is one of permanence. Thick walls composed of massive coralline limestone blocks are arranged into curving facades and interior apses that follow a highly consistent, clover-like ground plan. These layouts are oriented with a precision that suggests deliberate design rather than improvisation. Movement through the temples unfolds gradually, passing from open forecourts into increasingly enclosed chambers, subtly guiding participants inward. Stone altars, carved niches, and traces of red ochre suggest ritual activity, yet they stop short of explaining its meaning. Notably absent are any defensive features. There are no fortifications, battlements, or vantage points designed to dominate territory. Nothing about the architecture implies intimidation or control. Instead, the temples appear constructed for repeated visitation, for shared custom rather than centralized authority. They feel less like monuments of power and more like spaces of return. As attention lingers, quieter questions begin to emerge. The technical demands of constructing such buildings on a small island are considerable. While quarries lie nearby, the extraction, shaping, transport, and placement of these stones would have required coordinated labor, shared expertise, and social mechanisms capable of mobilizing people repeatedly over long periods of time. The tools available were simple, stone, bone, and wooden implements rather than metal, and yet the builders left behind no depictions of construction, no scenes illustrating technique or process. Only the finished forms remain. The temples do not read as tentative experiments. They appear instead as mature expressions of a tradition already refined, implying earlier developmental phases that either occurred elsewhere or employed materials that did not survive. Excavations reveal multiple layers of activity, but surprisingly little evidence of permanent domestic settlement directly associated with the temple complexes. This suggests that daily life may have been dispersed across the landscape, with the temples functioning as focal points that drew people together intermittently rather than housing them continuously. This separation between monumental space and domestic life complicates linear models of cultural development. It implies that architectural sophistication did not necessarily emerge alongside dense urban centers or rigid hierarchies. Instead, complex construction could arise within small, dispersed communities bound together by shared ritual obligations rather than centralized governance.
Artifacts recovered from the sites, figurines, pottery fragments, animal bones, reinforce this ambiguity. They point toward ceremonial feasting and symbolic practices, yet they do not clearly indicate a ruling elite or administrative class. The absence of weapons within the temple contexts further suggests that these gatherings were organized around cooperation rather than coercion. Still, contradictions persist. The temples required sustained investment over centuries, yet the society that built them left no clear evidence of social stratification proportional to that effort. The architectural forms are highly standardized, yet no visible administrative system can be identified. And despite their durability, the temples were abruptly abandoned around 2500 BCE, with no signs of gradual decline or transformation into other building types. Environmental explanations have been proposed, including soil exhaustion and climatic stress, but these remain partial. They do not fully account for the disappearance of a culture capable of such coordinated expression. What remains particularly striking is that the temple tradition appears fully formed early in its chronology, as though it emerged not from slow local experimentation, but from a pre-existing conceptual framework already understood by its builders. This observation does not require invoking lost civilizations. It only asks for recognition that cultural knowledge can be mobile and episodic, carried by people who leave little material trace beyond what they choose to monumentalize. Seen this way, the Gigantia temples may represent not the beginning of complexity on Gozo, but the visible residue of a broader pattern of ritual behavior that extended beyond the island and beyond the limits of preservation, expressed elsewhere in wood, earth, or temporary structures that have long since dissolved. The Maltese temples are unusual not because monumentality was rare, but because stone was chosen as the medium through which meaning was fixed. This choice granted them an archaeological longevity denied to countless other ritual sites. Careful interpretation allows for the possibility that small-scale societies repeatedly invested in monumentality as a way of stabilizing identity during periods of environmental or social uncertainty, creating shared spaces that reaffirmed cohesion even as populations fluctuated. When such systems transformed or failed, the monuments remained, stripped of their context and later reinterpreted as curiosities rather than continuations. The Gigantia temple's rounded forms, echoing organic shapes rather than rectilinear order, reinforce the sense that they belong to a worldview distinct from later architectural traditions, one less concerned with permanence through dominance than with continuity through repetition. Their abandonment does not signal dramatic collapse so much as silence, a cessation of use that left the structures physically intact but culturally unmoored. Today, standing within their walls, one is confronted not with evidence of a lost advanced civilization, but with a subtler realization, how easily complex human behaviors can emerge and disappear without leaving explanatory trails, and how the archaeological record privileges endurance over prevalence. The Gigantia temples endure because stone endures, not because they were the most important expressions of their time. This endurance distorts perspective, making them appear anomalous rather than representative. In the broader question of whether human civilization unfolded as a single unbroken ascent, these temples offer no dramatic answer, only a quiet suggestion that complexity may have surfaced earlier, more often, and in more fragile forms than the surviving record allows us to see, and that what we call origins may sometimes be nothing more than the last visible anchors of cycles whose beginnings and endings have otherwise slipped beyond recovery.
The hill that rises above the Hisar Valley does not announce itself as extraordinary. From a distance, its contours appear softened by erosion and long cultivation, blending into the surrounding landscape without drama. Yet at its summit, the ruins now referred to as Hisar Fortress quietly anchor a terrain that has witnessed thousands of years of movement, conflict, adaptation, and continuity. What first captures attention is not what dominates the skyline, but the stillness, an impression that something enduring lies beneath what is immediately visible. That stillness becomes more intriguing when confronted with the archaeological contradiction below the surface. While the surviving gate and sections of the walls largely reflect modern reconstruction based on late medieval descriptions, the ground beneath them preserves a far deeper and less orderly story.
This is a site whose history refuses to align cleanly with dynastic timelines or written records, instead unfolding through layers that suggest long-term significance independent of any single political authority. Archaeological investigations in and around the hill have revealed occupation levels extending back at least 2,500 years. Ceramics, tools, and traces of early fortification point to activity during the Achaemenid period, when the region was incorporated into an imperial network stretching from Central Asia to Iran and Mesopotamia. Even so, this attribution remains provisional. The density and repetition of material beneath the fortress indicates cycles of habitation that likely predate imperial administration, implying that the hill's importance emerged earlier, before it was formalized as a named stronghold. In these earlier phases, the hill may not have functioned as a fortress in the conventional sense. Instead, it likely served as a natural focal point, controlling access to water, arable land, and key transit routes through the valley. The geography of the Hisar Valley supports this interpretation, opening westward while channeling movement east into mountainous terrain. Such a setting would have encouraged early forms of enclosure and defensive oversight long before stone walls imposed a visible architectural order. Here, the first tension emerges between what can be seen and what must be inferred. Traditional descriptions frame Hisar Fortress as a medieval citadel, rebuilt and reoccupied by successive rulers. Yet the persistence of the site suggests that later builders were not selecting this location at random. They were inheriting a place already embedded with strategic and possibly symbolic value. Excavations around the hill have uncovered evidence of continuous settlement from the Bronze Age onward, including hearths, storage pits, and domestic structures that point to stable communities rather than temporary outposts. These findings are often treated as peripheral context, but they raise fundamental questions about when this location crossed the threshold from village to fortified center. The archaeological record shows no single moment of transformation. Instead, layers accumulate unevenly, marked by periods of intensive construction followed by phases of lighter use or apparent abandonment. This rhythm aligns only imperfectly with known historical disruptions such as invasions, climatic shifts, or political fragmentation. Rather than abrupt collapse and renewal, the hill appears to have adapted gradually, maintaining its relevance as social structures evolved around it. By the time Hellenistic influence reached the region following Alexander's campaigns, the area was already integrated into long-distance exchange networks. Yet the material evidence from this period is fragmentary, isolated artifacts rather than a distinct architectural phase, suggesting that external cultural influences were absorbed without fundamentally reshaping the site. A similar pattern persists through the Kushan and early Islamic periods, where material culture reflects participation in broader systems, while the physical form of the fortress remains difficult to define.
What survives today, especially the monumental gate reconstructed in the 20th century, creates the impression of a coherent structure tied to a specific era. Beneath it, however, the stratigraphy resists such clarity. Walls intersect earlier foundations, trenches cut through older deposits, and building materials are reused across centuries. These overlaps blur the line between origin and renovation, complicating any attempt to assign a definitive moment of foundation. Some researchers proposed that the earliest defensive features at Hisar consisted of earthen embankments reinforced with timber, structures effective in their time but unlikely to leave durable archaeological traces once eroded. This could explain the apparent gap between early occupation and later monumental architecture, yet it also implies a long developmental phase missing from the traditional narrative, one in which defensive planning existed without producing enduring stone markers. The absence of inscriptions or unmistakable architectural signatures from these early periods deepens the uncertainty. Interpretation must rely on spatial logic, environmental context, and comparison rather than direct evidence. The result is not a single missing date, but an extended interval during which the site was clearly important while remaining archaeologically understated. Medieval sources describe Hisar as a major administrative and military center, repeatedly damaged by earthquakes and warfare and subsequently rebuilt. These accounts emphasize resilience, but they begin long after the hill's strategic value had already been established. In doing so, they compress centuries of earlier use into a vague prehistory that receives little more than passing acknowledgement. Modern reconstruction, intended to make the fortress legible to contemporary audiences, unintentionally reinforces this compression. By privileging the most visually coherent phase, it smooths over the complexity beneath, transforming a multi-layered palimpsest into what appears to be a singular monument. When the site is viewed instead as a long-lived focal point whose function evolved incrementally from settlement hub to fortified center, the gaps in the record feel less like absences and more like evidence of continuity operating below the threshold of monumental expression. Not all power announces itself with stone walls. The prehistoric dimension of Hisar may lie not in a lost civilization or dramatic rupture, but in the accumulation of choices made by successive communities responding to the same landscape constraints. Each generation reinforced the hill's role without necessarily altering its appearance in ways that would survive archaeologically. In this sense, the fortress conceals no single hidden origin. What it preserves is a prolonged gestation, a slow convergence of defense, control, and settlement logic unfolding over centuries. Standing above the valley today, the reconstructed gate frames not only the horizon, but also the unresolved depth beneath it, where prehistory and history blur together. The true measure of Hisar Fortress is not the apparent age of its walls, but the length of time the hill itself has quietly structured human presence in this part of Central Asia, waiting for its earliest chapters to be read not as a lost beginning, but as an ongoing prelude whose full scope has yet to be defined. The stone tower of Jericho rises from the ancient mound of Tel es-Sultan with a solidity that feels almost unsettling when set against the delicacy of deep time. Emerging from layers of accumulated habitation, it stands as a dense, immovable presence in a landscape otherwise defined by erosion, rebuilding, and forgetting. Its form does not announce itself with ornament or grandeur, but with mass, stone stacked upon stone in a way that resists easy explanation. Constructed more than 10,000 years ago during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, the tower belongs to a moment when human communities are often imagined as tentative settlers, newly experimenting with sedentary life. This was a time of mud brick houses, small-scale agriculture, and flexible social arrangements, not, in conventional narratives, an era associated with large, enduring vertical architecture. And yet the tower stands precisely as that, a monumental intervention in stone. Jericho itself occupied an unusual ecological niche. Fed by perennial springs in the Jordan Valley, it offered reliable water in an otherwise arid region, enabling long-term occupation across millennia. This continuity has earned Jericho recognition as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world. Even so, the stone tower does not sit comfortably within a narrative of gradual urban emergence. It feels abrupt, excessive, and strangely out of step with its surroundings. Dating to around 8000 BCE, the tower rises over 8.5 meters high, with walls several meters thick at the base. Inside, a steep enclosed staircase of carefully cut stone steps spirals upward through the core of the structure. This was not a casual or improvised build. The staircase is narrow, allowing only single-file movement, and its enclosure creates an inward, almost isolating ascent.
The engineering reflects planning, precision, and a clear understanding of load, balance, and long-term stability. At first glance, the tower appears defensive. Its height and mass evoke fortification, and early interpretations framed it as a military structure. Yet this reading quickly weakens under closer scrutiny. There is no accompanying city wall of comparable scale from the same phase, no clear evidence of sustained warfare, and no strategic positioning that would make the tower an effective lookout or stronghold. It does not dominate the settlement in a militarily obvious way. Instead, the tower exists as a singular structure, embedded within the community, yet distinct from it. Its construction would have required significant communal labor, coordinated over time without offering an immediately practical return in terms of storage, defense, or habitation. Anchored directly into bedrock and rising through carefully laid courses of stone, the tower invites questions not about how it was built, but why it was built at all. The how can be approached archaeologically. Excavations reveal remarkable masonry, with stones selected and fitted to maintain stability across centuries. The structure survived earthquakes, environmental shifts, and thousands of years of burial beneath later occupation layers. This endurance complicates assumptions about early Neolithic engineering, suggesting a level of structural knowledge often underestimated in discussions of newly sedentary societies. The why, however, remains elusive. The staircase discourages crowd movement, implying that access may have been restricted or ritualized. The ascent feels deliberate and controlled, perhaps intended as an experience rather than a means to a practical end. Some researchers have suggested that the tower aligns with the setting sun at the summer solstice, raising the possibility of astronomical awareness and seasonal symbolism, though this interpretation remains debated. The broader settlement context deepens the puzzle. At the time, Jericho consisted primarily of round mud brick houses, modest in scale and impermanent in material, clustered around shared spaces. There is little evidence of social stratification or centralized authority that might readily explain the concentration of labor into a single monumental structure. The tower was not a residence, not a granary, and not convincingly a fortification. Its isolation within the architectural record of the period makes it difficult to place within a wider trend.
Radiocarbon dating confirms its great antiquity, placing it among the earliest large stone constructions known anywhere in the world. Yet it appears without clear precursors and leaves behind no immediate successors, as if architectural ambition briefly surfaced, fully formed, before receding again for centuries. This is where quiet contradictions accumulate, a society capable of monumental construction, yet leaving no comparable structures nearby, a potential cosmological marker devoid of overt symbolism, a communal investment disproportionate to subsistence needs. Functional explanations have been proposed. Some suggest the tower acted as a flood control feature or retaining structure in Jericho's spring-fed landscape. Others argue for a role in social or ritual life, perhaps as a focal point for gatherings tied to seasonal cycles, marking time rather than territory. If so, the tower represents not an early step toward militarized urbanism, but an experiment in monumentalizing shared concepts such as renewal, continuity, or ancestral presence. Yet all such interpretations remain speculative. The builders left no inscriptions, no iconography, no explicit statements of intent. What survives is the structure itself, an anomaly preserved by the durability of stone. Any wooden platforms, earthen markers, or perishable ritual installations that may once have accompanied it have long since vanished, leaving the tower to appear singular and unprecedented. In this sense, the tower may not have been unique in its time, only uniquely durable. It is possible that early sedentary communities experimented repeatedly with monumentality as a social technology, constructing focal structures to reinforce cohesion during periods of environmental stability.
When conditions changed, such investments may have been abandoned, leaving uneven material traces. Climatic fluctuations following the end of the Younger Dryas would have placed stress on early agricultural systems, encouraging cycles of aggregation and dispersal. The tower's burial beneath later occupation layers suggests not violent destruction, but gradual forgetting. New generations built over it, adapting to shifting circumstances, preserving the structure unintentionally as they moved on. This pattern complicates linear narratives of progress. It implies that architectural sophistication did not steadily advance from simple to complex, but appeared episodically, driven by social needs that were not always sustained. The stone tower of Jericho thus occupies an ambiguous position in human history, neither a clear beginning nor an end point, but a surviving fragment from a phase of experimentation whose broader contours are lost. It does not testify to a forgotten advanced civilization, but it does demonstrate that early human societies were capable of organizing labor, conceptualizing permanence, and shaping space in ways that challenge minimalist portrayals of the Neolithic. The tower stands as evidence that complexity can emerge early, recede, and leave behind isolated markers that later appear anomalous when stripped of their original networks. Its staircase, spiraling inward through stone, leads not to a definitive answer, but to a vantage point, one that once overlooked a living landscape of springs, fields, and dwellings, now reduced to stratified layers of earth. From that height, the builders may have observed celestial cycles, seasonal rhythms, or communal life unfolding below, embedding observation itself into architecture. Today, the tower offers a different kind of perspective. It quietly suggests that the deep past was shaped less by a single upward trajectory, but by cycles of innovation and forgetting, and that what we call the first cities may rest atop earlier, less visible experiments in organizing human life, preserved only where stone, chance, and burial conspired to keep their traces intact.
The archaeological site of Ajinatee looms on a low rise overlooking the fertile plains of southern Tajikistan, far removed from the dramatic ridgelines that define places like Hisar or Yamchun. Its remains assert a different kind of authority, one not derived from elevation or overt defensibility, but from the density of material layered beneath what appears, at first glance, to be a relatively modest Buddhist monastic complex. Traditionally dated to the 7th or 8th centuries CE and associated with the late Kushano-Sasanian world and the early Islamic transitional period, the site initially presents itself as a clearly defined religious center. Yet, when examined more closely, this accepted narrative begins to feel incomplete. The monastery does not stand in isolation. It rests atop a landscape whose human history extends far deeper than its surviving religious architecture would suggest. Ajinatee is best known for the discovery of a monumental reclining Buddha sculpture, fragmented yet immense in scale. Even in its broken state, the statue testifies to substantial resources, specialized craftsmanship, and sustained patronage at a time when Buddhism was still actively practiced in the region. The sculpture has become the symbolic anchor of the site, drawing interpretive focus toward its late antique phase. Beneath this visual centerpiece, however, the stratigraphy tells a longer and more complex story. Archaeological investigations have revealed earlier occupation layers below the Buddhist complex, including domestic structures, hearths, and utilitarian ceramics consistent with long-term settlement in the Vaksh Valley. This valley, with its fertile soils and access to river systems, had been attractive to human communities since at least the Bronze Age. Such evidence suggests that Ajinatee was not selected randomly for religious construction, but inherited a location already embedded within established patterns of land use, subsistence, and movement. The monastery's architectural layout, its courtyards, chapels, and perimeter walls, reflect Buddhist planning traditions recognizable across Central Asia. Yet its orientation and spatial organization also conform closely to the existing topography.
Rather than imposing a rigid geometric order onto the landscape, the builders appear to have adapted to it, negotiating with a site already shaped by generations of prior human activity. This sense of negotiation becomes clearer when examining the construction techniques, which combined fired brick, mud brick, and reused materials. Such choices point toward phased development and continuity of resources rather than a single abrupt foundation event. Ajinatee is often framed as evidence of Buddhism's late survival in the region before the Islamic conquests. While this framing is not incorrect, it tends to compress the site's deeper temporal dimensions, treating the monastery as a cultural endpoint rather than a midpoint within a much longer sequence. The Vaksh Valley functioned as a corridor linking Bactria, Sogdiana, and the Pamir regions, facilitating not only trade, but the gradual circulation of ideas, technologies, and religious practices. Long before Buddhist iconography appeared here, the valley supported settled agricultural communities whose material culture reflects continuity rather than rupture across millennia. Seen in this context, the emergence of a Buddhist monastery at Ajinatee appears less as a sudden transformation and more as a repurposing of a place already imbued with significance. Its importance had been established through repeated occupation and adaptation. The absence of monumental architecture from earlier phases does not necessarily signal a lack of social complexity, but rather different expressions of it, ones rooted in domestic organization, farming systems, and local networks that left subtler archaeological traces, now partially obscured by later construction. When the monastery eventually fell out of use, likely as a result of political, economic, and religious shifts during the early Islamic period, its abandonment did not erase the site's earlier history. Instead, it added another layer to an already complex palimpsest. Buddhist structures were damaged, reused, or gradually collapsed, folding back into the same soil that had supported earlier settlements. This process of decay and reintegration reflects continuity as much as change. The fact that Ajinatee was not immediately reoccupied with new monumental architecture after its abandonment has often been interpreted as evidence of cultural discontinuity. Yet this interpretation may overlook a simpler possibility, that the site's function shifted once again, returning to forms of use that are less archaeologically visible, such as seasonal agriculture or small-scale habitation. In this sense, the apparent gap between prehistoric settlement and Buddhist monumentality mirrors the later silence that follows the monastery's decline. Both gaps are shaped as much by archaeological visibility as by actual absence. The time gap hidden within Ajinatee is therefore not a void, but a compression, a narrowing of interpretive focus that privileges the most visually distinctive phase while sidelining the longer processes that made that phase possible. Even the reclining Buddha itself, often presented as an isolated masterpiece, gains new meaning when viewed against this deeper backdrop. It becomes not an anomalous intrusion, but the culmination of centuries of accumulated surplus, technical knowledge, and regional connectivity. As erosion and excavation continue to expose the site's lower layers, the boundaries between prehistoric settlement, religious center, and abandoned ruin begin to dissolve. What emerges instead is a continuum in which each phase depends on the groundwork laid by the previous one. Standing among the low walls and fragmented sculptures today, it becomes difficult to pinpoint the moment when Ajinatee became sacred, as distinct from the much earlier moment when it first became useful, inhabited, and familiar. It is within this ambiguity that the site's quiet mystery resides. Rather than marking the abrupt arrival or disappearance of belief systems, Ajinatee records the slower rhythm of human adaptation in the Vaksh Valley, a rhythm in which places are reused, reinterpreted, and reinscribed with new meanings over long spans of time. What lies hidden here is not a lost chapter, but the length of the book itself, extending far beyond the pages most often read.
Balbeck occupies a broad terrace in the Bekaa Valley, where the surrounding mountains pull back just enough to let the landscape breathe. The sense of scale reveals itself slowly. Nothing announces itself all at once. The ground opens, the horizon widens, and the sight settles into view with a quiet confidence that feels earned rather than imposed. At first encounter, Balbeck presents itself as a familiar expression of Roman imperial ambition. Scattered column drums lie where they fell, capitals rest half buried in earth, and the skeletal remains of temples rise in fragments whose inscriptions and proportions belong unmistakably to the classical world. The Temple of Jupiter dominates this initial reading. Its surviving columns, among the tallest ever raised by Rome, stand with a refinement that leaves little doubt about their origin or purpose. For a moment, the story feels stable, anchored in a civilization whose engineering skill, administrative reach, and architectural language are well understood. Yet, as attention drifts downward, away from the columns and toward the massive platform beneath them, that coherence begins to thin. At the base of the podium, embedded into the retaining wall, lies something quieter and far more disorienting. 3 colossal limestone blocks, each weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together with remarkable precision. Known collectively as the trilithon, they do not demand attention through decoration or symbolism. They simply exist, dense, restrained, and difficult to reconcile with the structures above them. These stones operate at a different register entirely, less ornamental, more elemental. Their faces are dressed flat, their joints tight, their scale resistant to easy explanation even within the broad capabilities of Roman construction. They are set several meters above ground level, not as foundations hidden below sight, but as visible components of the platform itself, quietly asserting their presence beneath the imperial facade. Nearby, in the ancient quarry, the sense of unease deepens. Even larger stones remain where they were cut, including the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman and other blocks that exceed 1,000 tons. These stones were never moved. Their abandonment suggests not failure, but experimentation, as if the builders approached the outer edge of feasibility, tested it, and chose to stop. What matters is not that these stones were left behind, but that they were attempted at all. The intrigue lies not in impossibility, but in excess. Roman temples across the empire achieved grandeur without resorting to blocks of this magnitude. Nothing in Roman religious architecture required stones of such size. Their use here feels less like necessity and more like inheritance, as though the builders were adapting to an existing platform rather than freely designing one from the ground up. Ancient literary sources offer little clarity. Roman authors describe the sanctuary and its cults, but they do not linger on the foundations. The massive substructure is treated as a given, already present, already stable, not worthy of explanation. Archaeological investigation supports the idea that the podium underwent multiple construction phases, with the largest stones belonging to an earlier stage that predates the visible Roman superstructure. Yet precise dating remains elusive, constrained by the difficulty of sampling blocks of such scale and the absence of associated organic material. This uncertainty introduces a subtle contradiction. Here is a foundation so monumental that it challenges modern engineering assumptions, yet archaeologically mute, detached from the textual and material context that might anchor it securely in time. The stones themselves offer hints without conclusions. Quarry marks suggest stone tools rather than metal saws. Their placement implies ramps, levers, and coordinated labor on a scale that presupposes long-term planning and centralized organization, though not necessarily advanced machinery.
The Bekaa Valley, fertile and strategically positioned between the Mediterranean coast and the interior, supported sustained human populations long before Roman annexation. The site's association with earlier deities, including the Phoenician god Baal, indicates that Balbeck was already a place of ritual significance when Rome arrived. In this light, the Roman temple complex appears less as an origin and more as an overlay, a monumental rearticulation of a sacred landscape whose importance extended far deeper into the past than surviving records can trace. The question, then, shifts, not how the Romans built Balbeck, but what they encountered when they chose to build there. Did the scale of the foundations reflect Roman ambition, or the constraints imposed by an inherited platform that demanded continuity rather than replacement? The absence of clear transitional layers between the megalithic base and the Roman additions complicates interpretation. It blurs the boundary between reuse and original construction, leaving open the possibility that builders separated by centuries shared the same site without sharing the same architectural intentions. Speculative restraint allows for a measured hypothesis. The foundations may belong to a broader Levantine tradition of monumental stonework that favored permanence and mass over articulation, a tradition largely invisible today because its other expressions, perhaps built of earth, timber, or smaller stone, did not endure. If so, the trilithon is not evidence of a lost advanced civilization, but a rare surviving node in a pattern of early monumentality whose wider context has eroded away. The Romans, encountering this immense and stable platform, may have recognized both its structural reliability and its symbolic weight. Rather than dismantle it, they chose to monumentalize it further, embedding their imperial language into a structure already anchored in deep time. This reading preserves continuity without exaggeration, allowing for cycles of construction, reuse, and reinterpretation that are common in long-lived sacred sites, though rarely so starkly visible. The mismatch in scale between foundation and superstructure remains unsettling, not because it defies physics, but because it defies expectation. It challenges the assumption that architectural ambition always increases steadily over time. Balbeck suggests instead that moments of extreme material investment can occur early, driven by social or religious imperatives that do not align neatly with later technological trajectories. Such moments may be followed not by repetition, but by adaptation. The abandoned quarry stones reinforce this impression. They feel less like failed projects than paused intentions, evidence of a culture that pushed toward the limits of feasibility and then chose a different path. In the broader question of whether human civilization unfolds as a single linear ascent, Balbeck offers a grounded yet disquieting perspective. Some of the largest and most enigmatic constructions may represent not the peaks of a forgotten world, but residual anchors from phases of human organization that rose, stabilized, and transformed. Standing among the fallen columns and immense blocks, it becomes clear that the visible grandeur above is only the latest chapter in a much longer architectural conversation. Most of its earlier lines have been lost. What survives here is not a complete story, but a structural remainder, stone that endured when context did not, quietly suggesting that the deep past was punctuated by episodes of ambition whose traces persist unevenly, shaping history not through continuity, but through the stubborn persistence of mass.